In light of the controversy that is Will Smith lately, I'm about to say something even more controversial. One of my favorite movies by Will is 1999's Wild Wild West. Go on, blow up the comments about what you think is better, but get ready, because we're about to dive into it right now. Spoiler alert, while I might be giving you my opinion on the film, that's no substitute for watching it for yourself. Links to the film are in the description. And for those of you that need to hear this, this is just a movie. All stunts are for the sake of story and shouldn't be attempted on your own. Viewer discretion is advised. We start off by watching a scientist running through the swamp of Louisiana, but he's being chased by a magnetic table saw. Eventually, he just can't outrun it, and he turns to meet his fate. After his head is cleanly removed, we meet Bloodbath McGrath as he removes the giant saw blade. In West Virginia, we see James West getting close and personal with a woman in a water tower, but he's pulled away when he notices some of McGrath's men arriving to transport cases of something. Bell tries to bring him back to the current situation that's right in front of him, but soon the wagon takes out the leg of the water tower, and James rides a waterfall right down in front of the men. As he stands and bears all in front of them, they start to attack him, but he takes them out quickly. Across town, we see that McGrath has his eyes on a rather fiery redhead at the bar, but he seems to be waiting for something else. When he looks around, he sees some of his men bringing a chest with someone stuffed inside, and his associate has them go up to check on it. Meanwhile, the redhead is approached by another drunk, but after turning down his many advances, we see that it's actually a guy in disguise, and his trinkets knock out the man. While James hitches a ride on the wagon that's transporting explosives before it takes off, we see that the redhead has approached McGrath, who immediately takes her up on her offer. When they go to her room, the drunk has come back too and asks what kind of lady she is, and McGrath simply shoots him and claims her for himself. When he tosses her up on the stage to sing, McGrath empties out the wax from his horn ear. I don't even know if this was a real thing that happened or how this would even work, but the image of him draining his ear has stuck with me for over 2 decades now. I'm sold that I'll never get rid of it. Just as the redhead finishes up a song, they go upstairs to get a room, and James stops the wagon just before it goes off a hill into the saloon. While he tries to find a way in on the second story, the redhead uses another trinket to hypnotize McGrath. Now the redhead drops the act to ask questions about missing scientists. But when things start to go south, James kicks in the window and knocks out McGrath. When he comes to, he tackles James through a wall and runs outside to get his men to attack him. In a little bit of time, the redhead reveals himself to be a US Marshal named Gordon, and James just looks like his whole world has been turned upside down. Outside, the big baddie, Loveless, sends the bag of explosives into the saloon. Then we just jump ahead to a brand new day when James walks into the White House like everything's fine. How they got out, I don't know. We just assume that plot armor keeps them from blowing up. At the White House, James goes into the president's office, and he immediately realizes that the man playing the president is actually Gordon in disguise again. After James fires his gun in the Oval Office, the real president barges in and takes them to tell them about their new mission that they're working on together. You know, the president does not just barge into a room with gunfire going on without a whole bunch of Secret Service with him. I don't know when the Secret Service was started, but James just walked by 4 armed guards on his way in. Where were they? The president tells James and Gordon that they have 1 week to figure out who's sending them warnings of a terrible invention, and the two of them go to get to the train. Outside, James hops on his horse, but Gordon shows that his inventions are where his strength is as he pulls up on a motorized bike. Gordon manages to get to the train first, and James tries to ride up beside the train as Gordon does some needlepoint work. When James hops onto the caboose of the train, he lands on a spring that shoots him inside the chair next to Gordon. This is definitely Gordon's train. I wouldn't trust anything that Gordon invents. When James punches Gordon, Gordon activates a giant hammer that knocks him onto the pool table that throws him under the train. How many times can you really plan to use that specific giant invention? They could have used that at the Oscars, I guess. Sorry, had to get in one. I'm done. When James comes back up, the conductor comes back to find out where they're going, and Gordon decides to let Professor Morton tell them where to go. Professor Morton is the head scientist from the beginning of the movie, and Gordon decides to use another invention to use the professor's eyes as projectors. After disgusting James with the head, they realize that McGrath is going to a party in New Orleans. Once they arrive in New Orleans, Gordon tries to find a costume for him and James to wear. He even tries to pull out a manservant costume to try and let James blend in, but he's not about that. When James tells Gordon that his last disguise wasn't that believable, he points out that his breasts were terrible, and Gordon has him play with his fake breasts. When James finds out that he's using buckwheat to fill them, he replaces it with water and has him feel his fake breast now. It might seem so stupid now, but this was some of the best laughs in 1999. That and the fact that James really did walk into a costume party of former slave owners as a black cowboy with a gun. Literally no one questions him except for one guard outside that he knocks out. That's definitely not how this would have gone. Once inside, James looks around, and he's met by East, who tries to find out who he knows there. James tries to ask about McGrath, but she swears that he's not on the list for the night. This is actually Loveless's party, and she asks if there's anyone else that he knows. James spots who he thinks is Gordon in disguise again, and East heads to the floor to get ready. Soon, a giant Lincoln head rolls out, and Loveless pops out. When I first watched this, I legitimately thought that Kenneth Branagh didn't have any legs. When I saw him with legs, I swore that it was wrong. After addressing his guests, Loveless goes over to James, and they exchange some racy banter before he heads to his office to meet with McGrath. James heads to the door to listen in, and he finds out that Loveless is planning something big at a meet. After Loveless and McGrath leave, James breaks in to try and find out where they're meeting later that night. While he's snooping, East comes in and puts some moves on him. This was the hottest thing when it came out for me. But then it turned into the worst nightmare as the painting behind him came to life. It was so trippy, and it was another time that I wondered how long these people were just waiting for an intruder in those paintings. Is this something that happens at every party? After James shoots all of the men, he heads out to dance with who he thinks is Gordon, and after he tells her what he found out, he decides to drum on her breasts. Well, this isn't Gordon, and after he does this, all of the men take James outside to hang him. Meanwhile, the real disguised Gordon breaks into a sex dungeon where he finds Rita locked up. And after finding out that she's looking for the same scientists as he is, he breaks her out. Back outside, James tries to defend himself and boost the morale of all of the rednecks that are there, and he actually seems to be winning the crowd over. But when he gets to addressing the woman, he tries to make things right by asking her to marry him. She's surprised by that, and he decides to tell her that he thought she was a man. Well, that doesn't go much better. Suddenly, Gordon and Rita ride around in a wagon, and James ends up finding out that the rope is another of Gordon's inventions. He uses the stretchy rope to slingshot himself onto the wagon. After James takes one of the horses ahead, we see that McGrath is on a boat with Loveless and his men are waiting on the shore. While the tank kills McGrath's men, he activates some little gun in his chair. Then they use the dog on the boat to make the RCA Records label mascot. I don't know why, but this is one of my favorite Easter eggs. When Gordon and Rita get to the point, they find that everyone's dead and James is already there. James tells them a story about when he was in the army and how McGrath murdered his family. Then he hears McGrath moaning from the water, and McGrath uses his last breaths to tell James that Loveless is responsible for both massacres. Rita tells James that she knows where Loveless is going, and they head to the train to tell the conductor to head to Utah, the same state that the president is heading to as well. James makes Gordon leave Rita behind, but she finds her way on board through the spring floor while he talks about her ample assets. After coming to the conclusion that Rita's there to stay, they set her up in the bedroom, and they give her a nightgown that gives her a nice little breeze. The next morning, the train comes up on Loveless's train, but it disappears on the other side of a tunnel. That's right, more gears and contraptions. This spider tank is full of surprises. I want everything Loveless has. As a response, James uses the pool table flip trick to get under the train, and Gordon activates a pulley system that takes James out. After the cord snaps, James rolls under Loveless's train and uses the stretchy rope to get himself on top. After taking out a man that attacks him, James throws the man down the pipe of the train, but Loveless shoots a harpoon into Gordon's train. Now that both trains are stopped, James goes on board, but Rita's activated a pool ball that Gordon's reinvented into a sleeping gas bomb. Stop letting Gordon touch things! Gordon and James wake up in a little section outside with the magnetic collars around their necks. Loveless steals their train and leaves them there to die. James sets off the magnetic saw blades, and now they have to run through the cornfield. Eventually, they leap into each other's arms over a gully, and the blades explode when they hit each other. While they might be alive, they're covered in disgusting clay mud. After an amusing attempt to knock off their magnetic collars by any means necessary, they end up finding Gordon's toolkit, which was actually in his pocket. The last place anyone expected to look on Gordon. That night, Gordon finds out that James knows a lot about how to survive in the desert, and James tells him about how he was raised by Indians in the area. The next morning, Gordon decides to carry around his magnet collar, and that ends up helping them find the train tracks Loveless used to get to Spider Canyon. Once there, they find what Loveless has been working on. Yet another memorable steampunk wonder in this movie, the giant tarantula robot. I'm gonna say it again. Can I have it, please? Imagine going to work or picking up the kids at school in this thing. Now that Loveless is marching this giant spider to the president, Gordon comes up with another invention to bring it down. But James doesn't think they have time for this. They hop on their horses and chase after the spider. Later, the president's trying to drive the final spike into the Great Railroad, but Loveless crashes the party. Loveless tells the president that he's demanding the surrender of the United States. Suddenly, Gordon shows up disguised as the president. Well, Loveless decides to capture both of them, and one of his women ends up shooting James off of the spider. They leave James's body on the ground, and they head to a celebration that Loveless is having to celebrate his takeover of the states. Meanwhile, James wakes up and realizes that Gordon had given him his bulletproof vest. Now, this is something that you won't soon forget. Loveless goes to execute Gordon, but James crashes the party. Or should I say the belly dancer. This is something that I feel like Will might definitely regret in his career, but then his bra starts whirring and blows fire. I want that too now. Loveless gets away with the president, but everyone else is safe now. When they try to come up with a way to bring down the giant spider, James tells Gordon that it might be time to try out his idea. It turns out that Gordon has rigged his motorized bike with wings, and they're going to fly onto the spider. After dropping themselves off of a cliff, the invention works, and they fly after Loveless. After Loveless destroys a little western town, Gordon and James fly over him and drop glycerin bottles on the spider. It's not enough to bring it down, and one of Loveless's girls shoots them down. Now that they're on the spider, Loveless sends James down to deal with some freaky lackeys. He manages to hold his own against them, but when he comes across a Frankenstein kind of man, it starts to look like he might be in trouble. He beats the man in the metal head with a giant wrench, but the man just keeps coming. Once they reach the edge, something seems to short-circuit the man, and he just falls off. Now, Loveless decides to come down, and at first, James seems to have the upper hand, but that changes quickly. Again, I want Loveless's chair. It's a tarantula chair. He's riding a metal spider inside a giant metal spider! Gordon pulls out his little pea shooter and fires his one bullet. He manages to shoot the spider in the leg, and Loveless is in trouble now. Up top, Gordon takes control of the spider, but they're headed for a cliff. Meanwhile, Loveless manages to pull himself over to his chair, where he fires his last shot from his chair. He narrowly misses, and at the same time, Gordon manages to stop the spider just as it takes a step off the cliff. Loveless spins to the edge where his chair gets stuck, and James grabs onto him. James finally gets the revenge he's been looking for, as he pulls on the lever that sends him and Loveless careening over the edge. But he manages to grab onto a chain with one of the henchmen on the end. With their mission accomplished, Gordon and James get their next mission from the president, and they ride off into the sunset on their new giant metal spider. While I might love westerns now, oddly enough, I think this movie might have started my fascination with them. While I might love the serious westerns now, the charm of a Barry Sonnenfeld movie definitely gave this movie the charm it needed. If you remember watching this on VHS, you also know that there are 2 music videos after the credits. Now you can just YouTube those, but it was part of the charm. Give it a shot. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more like this one. Comment what you think I should watch next, and I'll see you in the next video.